I'm Melody Knowles, currently serving as the acting dean and president of Virginia Theological Seminary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Current students and faculty at Virginia Seminary, former students of our guest speaker, theologians at institutions such as Georgetown, George Mason, Gettysburg, and Marist College, especially Marist College, welcome. The Zabriskie Lectureship was created to honor the memory of Alexander Zabriskie, former dean and faculty member at Virginia Theological Seminary. And these lectureships serves as an occasion where we can listen in on emerging thoughts of the smartest people of our day. According to the dean who persuaded tonight's speaker to come and work at the University of Chicago Divinity School, David Tracy was the faculty hire which gave him the most pride. Given that this list includes no less than Paul Tillich, Paul Ricoeur, and Aliada, I think that's pretty good praise. Our lecturer tonight is the Andrew Thomas Greeley and Grace McNichols Greeley Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Catholic Studies at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Tracy was born in New York and did his doctoral work at Georgetown University in Rome under Bernard Lonergan during the Second Vatican Council, where at the Gregorian they had their own version of chapel, class, and lunch, only entirely in Latin. His first book was on Lonergan, and then in 1975 he published Blessed Rage for Order and the Analogical Imagination in 1981. One of the most influential concepts articulated in the Analogical Imagination is the concept of a classic, a work of art or literature, experience, event, or symbol with an excess of meaning that can be reinterpreted in different ages or cultures again and again and again without exhausting the truth it discloses. It resists domestication. And just personally, as someone who spends her own best days working with the biblical text and various interpretations of that text throughout time, your consideration of the text as a classic has been particularly rich for me. The power of Tracy's concept of the classic is on full display in his 1987 book, here's my prop, Plurality and Ambiguity, where he gives his own interpretation of the religious significance of hope. These engagements have made Tracy a living embodiment of Lonergan's axiom, be attentive, be intelligent, be responsible, and, if necessary, change. And though he might have changed in some of his own intellectual opinions, what hasn't changed is his ongoing, passionate engagement with the world. Even as he continues to work away on his big book on God, Tracy embodies a theology that isn't an invitation to a quiet, reclusive life, but a struggle for justice, participating in the liturgy, preaching every day when I was in Hyde Park at the Catholic campus ministry, and serving in a soup kitchen on Chicago's South Side. As a teacher, he always made time for his students, and his brilliance as a lecturer is legendary. As one student put it, he's going to rearrange your intellectual furniture. And for those who know him, though, of course, the most striking thing about David Tracy is his unfailing kindness, generosity, and graciousness. So it's not only an honor, but our great pleasure to say, David Tracy, welcome to Virginia Seminary.
Thank you all very much, and especially my thanks to your distinguished and elegant Dean and President. It's very good to be here at this famous Virginia Theological Seminary, which I've heard of most of my intellectual life. I once taught in Washington at Catholic University for 2 years, and even then, I heard about it. So I'm very happy to finally see it. It's very impressive. And the faculty is truly distinguished. And the student body seems very alive from the ones I met at lunch. And I'm sure the others. I thought maybe I should make a comment or two on my lecture topic tonight, since it's not necessarily, for example, Fénelon is not necessarily someone that everyone reads frequently. So let me mention just a word about him. Descartes, I presume everyone knows, the father of modern philosophy. Fénelon was a 17th century spiritual writer who, with his companion in mysticism and mystical theology, Jean-Marie de la Motte Bouvier, like Jacqueline, Guyon, usually called in the literature Madame Guyon, as he is usually called Archbishop Fénelon. Well, together, it's very like, to give a contemporary example, their relationship, as far as I can see, was very like what I understand to be the relationship of Hans Urs von Balthasar and Adrian von Speer. That is to say, von Speer was a true mystic, so was Guyon. And then the male, all he could do, like if I were around, I'd love to be with a mystic, would be to take dictation and then try to turn it into clearer theology, which is what Balthasar claims he did, and what Fénelon claims he did with the reflections. Now, Fénelon was also, I maintain, this is original and therefore perhaps wrong, a couple of others see it. I think he was the one person in the 17th century who understood Descartes on the infinite, which is, as Levinas has rightly argued, an absolute breakthrough notion in Descartes, which most readers of Descartes and most scholars of Descartes, especially in the English-speaking world, don't get. Fénelon did. Most people think, well, it's Malebranche who understood Fénelon. He didn't, as a matter of fact, nor did Spinoza, nor did Leibniz, great as they were in many other ways. Fénelon did, so I maintain. And he was also, as I repeat, so this is the lecture in a way. The first part will be in a way on what I could call mind. That is to say, Descartes on the idea of the infinite in the Meditations and Fénelon's reading of it. The second part, I would say, is on heart, the turn to the heart. And then I'll end with the comparison of two great 17th century thinkers who turned to the heart, namely Fénelon and Pascal, and in very different ways. Their difference is like the difference of Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, or Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. And I, since I've liked them all, I would like to say why and how that might relate. I'll also speak, well, maybe at the beginning. It is often thought that people, mystics, especially mystics of what for Guyon and Fénelon controversially was called pure love of God. That is to say, you love God for God's own sake, not because you hope to get some reward from God. And it takes a long time, various stages of the spiritual and then in the end mystical life to reach pure love. They would maintain, and so would others reasonably, I think. And especially then a philosopher, when he had trouble, both in Rome, though the Pope at the time, Innocent XI, actually liked him very much and was very reluctant to condemn some of his thoughts, but was forced to, in fact, by Louis XIV, who didn't like him, even though he had had him as tutor of his grandson for a while, but then turned against him and against Guillaume. At any rate, so he was exiled in the last 10 years of his life to the, he was an archbishop, so they couldn't quite throw him out completely. They exiled to the Archdiocese of Cambrai in northern France, near the Belgian border. The reason for mentioning that is that it was a remarkable time to be archbishop there, and he was excellent. He was a great pastor, which no one expected, because he was a philosopher. And he was a mystic of pure love. They said, well, exile him there, he'll just disappear. He didn't, because he was such a good pastor. And at the time, that was the largest diocese in France, and it was always at war. There was always a war going on because of Louis XIV fighting with everyone else, especially with the Dutch and the Belgians and the English at the time. So he's in the diocese where the war is going back and forth. He gives up his episcopal palace turns it into the hospital for the wounded of both sides, typical of him. And he founds a seminary, which was badly needed. And famine was always striking, and he was always there. So I mentioned this at the beginning, since I'll be talking about his thought, as he is proof that even a philosopher, even a mystic of pure love, can become a good pastor. So perhaps that will encourage some of you mystics and philosophers for your future work, I presume, at the seminary, from the seminary. All right, that's perhaps enough. I'm obsessed for many years with the issue of the names of God. And I have become persuaded that with Duns Scotus, who's the only one, other one, and Fénelon, that the first name, not the only, of course, but the first name is the infinite, which leads to the incomprehensible. At a talk in Georgetown in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk of how it began, this discussion of the infinite in philosophy with Plotinus. Plato and Aristotle no to the infinite, because the infinite is formless. It lacks form, and therefore it can't be perfect as the ultimate reality God must be. Right? And in theology with the great Gregory of Nyssa. And if you follow the infinite through theological and philosophical history, it keeps emerging every so often. For example, Augustine held to it, but he didn't develop it much. But he did hold to it, to name God, I mean. It was a minority opinion among the medievals. The two great medieval philosophers and theologians who did speak of God as infinite were Thomas Aquinas. One of the times he disagrees with Aristotle, because for Aristotle there can be no absolute infinite, only a quantitative infinite of space, time, and number. And above all, Scotus, who is the one who argues for God's infinity as the first name of God. It's Scotus, in fact, even though they were otherwise Thomist in a way, like Fénelon and Descartes, who influences the 17th century mystical theologians and spiritual theologians, which is very interesting. Then it reemerges, it's silent, it is not a central category in the Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. It was for Nicholas of Cusa, of course, and Bruno. And it becomes so much later with Schleiermacher and Hegel. And for me, Schleiermacher with Gregory of Nyssa and Fénelon and Descartes is, I think, the best. You remember, for Schleiermacher, religion itself is a sense and taste of the infinite. And then he works it out philosophically in his dialectic. And I think he's considerably better, in fact, than the far more famous philosopher on the infinite in the period, namely Hegel. And in our own period, of course, philosophically, it's the great Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas in Totality and Infinity. And it's a few theologians, though not many, such as Pannenberg and the Berkeley people with Russell and others, especially people who work with science and religion, because, of course, it's a crucial category in mathematics and in physics and cosmology. Well, So, the 17th century, which you may remember Alfred North Whitehead rightly called the century of genius. It's incredible, that century. I mean, it's Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, Fénelon. Compared to it, other centuries are 2 or 3 geniuses. They had a whole list. It's also usually called the century of Augustine, because they're all arguing over who's right on Augustine. So is Fénelon. And Descartes later realizes, when someone shows it to him, that, your cogito ergo sum is in Augustine. It's ne fallor sum. He said, really? Yes. And then he said, yes, that's good news. And it's also called often the century of mystics. Mysticism returns as a major force, both in spiritual life and in theology. I agree with Hans Urs von Balthasar, not on all things, I'm more with Rahner usually, but I agree with him on this, that one of the greatest disasters of the history of theology is the splitting off of spirituality and theology, and for that matter, philosophy and spirituality, which you can see in Plato and the early philosophers. As Adot shows at length, for the ancient philosophers, philosophy was not just a theory, and it was not just a profession, it was a way of life, a spiritual way of life. If you were a Stoic every day, you would engage in spiritual exercises to heighten your attentiveness of your logos to the logos you believe pervading the universe. If you were Epicurean, you would do other exercises, a Platonist. That's very different, yes? There are some modern philosophers who do that. Nietzsche was one, Kierkegaard was another, Simone Weil is another, Foucault was another. But on the whole, it's professionalized and separated. So I should have realized only later, I should have titled this The Infinite in Philosophy, not just philosophy and theology, but also spirituality, as linking the two. Okay, enough of that. And I will watch my time, I promise. So part one on mind, Descartes and the idea of the infinite. Two preliminary notes on Descartes before my analysis. One is philosophical, the other is religious or spiritual. Philosophically, Descartes, justly named, of course, the father of modern philosophy, as he indeed is often misinterpreted in my judgment, especially by Anglophone interpreters, even the best of them. And there are some very good ones like Anthony Kenny and Bernard Williams and others. An all too familiar interpretation is the following: that Descartes' philosophy begins with radical doubt, which it does, but that is misread, usually, as a more sophisticated form of 17th century skepticism, especially responding to Montaigne, whom everyone's responding to. Or alternatively, what is now called a rationalist foundationalism, which is also not. Grounded in the indubitable, because clear and distinct evidence of the cogito in the first meditation. I'm speaking mainly as you see of the third, but there it is in the first. Neither interpretation is correct. The fact is, in my judgment, Descartes' principle of radical doubt is in fact intended by him, not as it's often read, as a more radical formulation of skepticism. Skepticism was the problem of the 17th century, everyone's problem. Just as I would say today, nihilism is the problem for any serious thinker. Skepticism can become even more radical with nihilism. In fact, Descartes' cogito principle in the first meditation and elsewhere in the rules is, of course, one of the two principal foundations of his philosophy in the first meditation. His Meditations is his greatest work, I think. But as the third meditation makes clear, as Levinas showed, it wasn't till Levinas that people really began to see this. I didn't see it till Levinas, and I read it since my youth. Makes clear the cogito itself, as finite, must be grounded for Descartes. It's what people miss in the idea of the infinite, which encompasses the finite, not the reverse. As it's usually read, cogito, and then finite cogito, then you can argue to the infinite. You don't. As Levinas rightly says, the idea of the infinite in Descartes as the perfect infinite makes the thinker think more than you think. If you can think the idea of the infinite, you're thinking more than as a finite thinker you can think. That's the greatness of and the amazing part of the idea. Plotinus and Gregory of Nyssa and Nicholas of Cusa and Schleiermacher also, I think, saw that. But it's Descartes in the modern period who shows it with clarity. Okay. In fact, Levinas is even willing to say that Descartes' idea of the infinite, along with Plato's idea in the Republic of the good beyond being and beyond intelligence, and Plotinus in the Enneads of the One, are three, he calls them instant merveilleux, extraordinary and marvelous moments in the history of philosophy, breakthrough moments where you think something really new, and importantly new. For Levinas, the idea of the infinite is the idea by which I think more than I think, and it breaks every totality system. Totality and infinity. Like other instant merveilleux in the history of philosophy, this idea, and I think it through Descartes too, because he never goes back to it. By the fifth meditation, he's returning to arguments, traditional arguments for the existence of God, which is not what's happening in the third meditation. It's not an argument for the existence of God. It's this idea that once you think it, you cannot but think God. I'm not sure that, well, the idea of the infinite is therefore distinct from what is in fact the subsidiary Cartesian arguments on the existence of God, especially in the fifth meditation, where he does the traditional arguments of so-called cosmological and the ontological argument. The only one I've ever thought that really helps. I've always agreed with Hartshorne on that. The first Cartesian claim, namely the intuitive, not discursively argued, arrived at idea, like the arguments for the existence of God, but the purely intuitive idea. You can see why a mystic like Fénelon will go to it, or any Platonist would go to it. Contemplation, not only discursive argument, much important as the latter is. Well, Descartes in the fifth meditation, this is what threw everyone, I think, had 5 names for God. If you follow the philosophers after him, by which I mean Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, even Kant, you will notice that they take one or another of the names, but they don't take the infinite, except for Fénelon. Incomprehensible power. The summa of perfection must be the perfect one. And then most famously, and rather disastrously, God is causa sui. God is the one being who is the cause of itself. That's the one that Heidegger, I think, persuasively shows is a disaster. Because it makes God under the control of logic and ontology, and it makes them under control of this notion of God as cause of itself. Heidegger calls that onto-theological name of God. Jean-Luc Marion even more forcefully calls it the causa sui, an idol, not a compliment. In sum, Descartes' major philosophical work, the Meditations, includes the 4 principal philosophical positions with all the philosophers after him trying to correct him, develop him, give an alternative to him. He's the key, like Kant is in the next century. Emphasize the role of the cogito, of course, the turn to the subject in modern philosophy. The idea of the infinite and the nature, of course, I don't deny it at all, of Descartes' new mechanical philosophy of extension, which is constituted, alas, solely by efficient causality and eliminates all final causality. That's what Leibniz attacked him on, rightly, I think, or Whitehead later. Well, another thing I might mention is, though this relates more to to Gregory of Nyssa and others, that the great new emphasis on the apophatic tradition in theology, what God is not, as distinct from what God is, the cataphatic, is, I think, a very fruitful tradition, meaning the incomprehensible God, right? But in my judgment, if you read Nyssa carefully, and Plotinus, and Descartes, and Fénelon, and Nicholas of Cusa, and Schleiermacher, one sees that the logic is God is incomprehensible, the famous apophatic name of God, because God is infinite, not the reverse, as it's often read. Well, I think I'll move on so that we don't get behind. The second point is not philosophical strictly on the third meditation, the idea of the infinite, but spiritual, even for Descartes, which is also not usually mentioned with him. Let me summarize this. It's very interesting, I think. In the 17th century Paris, the papal nuncio, who was a very humanistic and thoughtful and liberal in those terms of the period, and the famous founder of French spirituality, Cardinal de Bérulle, always fighting Cardinal Richelieu, but Bérulle, and they, and sort of all of Paris, intellectuals, came to the papal nuncios one afternoon, early 17th century, to hear this philosopher whose name no one even knows anymore, who claimed to provide a new philosophy, because they were quite aware, as everyone who thought was, that the traditional Suaresian scholasticism which ruled was finished. It could not account for the great breakthrough intellectually of the 17th century, the scientific revolution. It simply couldn't handle it intellectually. As Herbert Butterfield, I think, rightly said, compared to the impact on Western thought of the scientific revolution, even the Renaissance and the Reformation were family quarrels. It's the scientific revolution that broke apart everything. That's why the 17th century is so exciting. Well, the papal nuncio and Bérulle, both of whom had been trained scholastically, realized it's over. You can't, it doesn't help. They're all looking for a new philosophy. This man, this gentleman whose name no one knows anymore, showed up and said, I have one. And he went through it, and Bérulle noticed that the very young philosopher who had not written anything yet, René Descartes, was sitting there puzzled. Everyone else was applauding wildly. He was not. And Bérulle afterwards said to him, Monsieur Descartes, why are you not impressed like everyone else? He said, he's quite wrong on every point, and he went through all the points in that Descartes mind. And Bérulle said to him, show up in my office tomorrow. And it's apparently the case. He said, Monsieur Descartes, we desperately need a new philosophy. For theology, too. You are to write it. Go home and write. And he knew it was a bit busy in Paris. He was rather active as a sort of gallant. And so he went, as everyone's sensible in the period, went to the Netherlands and found a small town where he could have solitude and write, and did, and came up with the new philosophy that took over really everyone eventually. It's an interesting story. It shows that Descartes also kept in touch then. Bérulle was the founder of the French oratory, the Oratorian Fathers. Very distinguished tradition in France and Italy, less so here. And Descartes clearly kept in touch with the Oratorians. He was very interested in and moved, and he was quite clear against many readings of him. He was a quite sincere Catholic Christian, even to the point where he was interested in Bérulle and these spiritual and mystical writers. The problem is, I've asked great Descartes scholars in France, like Amagat, well, what was his spirituality? Clearly he's interested in one. Clearly he's in touch with the Oratorians even when he's left Paris. And the answer of a good scholar was, we don't have any letter yet. About every 3 years they find another letter or two of Descartes, but they haven't found a letter to the oratory yet. So, but he's pretty clearly interested. I'm going to move ahead again to the second part, from the turn to mind to the turn to the heart, as in Pascal's perhaps most famous statement, which Fénelon could have said too. The heart has reasons which reason knows not of. Le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît pas. Great statement. But it can go several ways, of course, right? Meaning the heart will bring in more about the affections and the will as a way of naming God. So in my judgment, what happens is Fénelon, who's already a very spiritual man, meets Jean-Marie Guyon, this extraordinary spiritual writer and mystic of pure love. He is completely taken by her, the way Balthasar seems to have been by Adrian von Speyer. And together they work out what can be called a mystical theology. And what interests me is the name of God moves from the Descartes, which I repeat, Fénelon's the one who understands the radicality of Descartes on God as infinite. From God as infinite to, once you have a mysticism of love, or for that matter, an ordinary Christian life of charity, you would say, not just the infinite, God is infinite love, becomes the argument. Bernard Lonergan, my teacher, I think was characteristically exact in describing faith itself as, quote, a new knowledge born of love. When you're in love, things do become, you become more aware, more alert, more alive. Now you can also be blind, admittedly, but love does make one provide a sort of new insight into the world. Having children, loving children, or falling in love, right? And falling in love with God. Faith itself as that. Well, let's move on then to, I've always loved, for example, Wesley, which Schubert Ogden often uses, as you know, John. Charles Wesley, I believe, great hymn, God is pure, unbounded love. That's Fénelon. That's Guyon. And maybe it was Descartes, if we could only find a letter or two. It would stop the readings of him, which are wrong. Now, as a philosopher, François Fénelon cultivated, criticized, and expanded the new philosophy of Descartes into an entirely new philosophical theology that was grounded in the idea of God as the infinite. And in the mystical tradition he learned from Jean-Marie Guyon on pure love, the pure love of God, and God's own self, God's self as infinite love, evoking the pure love of Christians. Especially in his early work, which too few people read, the treatise on the existence of God, and his early commentary on Descartes. This is before he's met Guyon and pure love, when he's more purely a philosopher. In a way, it's good, I think, that he was that for a while. And in his latest summary of his thought for the future region of France, Fénelon was unusual because, unlike many theologians, he was both a first-rate philosopher and a mystic, eventually, through Guyon, and a mystical theologian of pure love, so that he could come up with the name of God as infinite love. Now, let me speak a bit about, I don't want to speak about all his troubles with Louis XIV and Bishop Bossuet. If you like intellectual bullies, read Bossuet. It was so awful to Guyon, in my opinion. She sends him all her private reflections. Private. He tells the whole world. He publishes them, and then has her condemned. Lovely man. My French friends tell me he's wonderful. I don't see it. But they say, well, all you foreigners and all Protestants love Fénelon. But we understand Bossuet. Perhaps. You know, Fénelon was, in the 19th and 20th century, including in this country, among Anglicans, Methodists, and Quakers, even more popular than he was among his fellow Catholics. He was a very popular figure for those centuries. He was immediately translated into English and German, as a matter of fact. All right. I don't want to go over time, so I think I'm going to, I hope it's reasonably clear. If you want to read all the details, I'll leave a copy if you wish. And remember, and I'll end with this on Fénelon, he's a fascinating thinker, not sufficiently read these days, I think. I was surprised at what a good philosopher he was. I didn't know that. I knew he was a mystical theologian with Guillaume. But he's also a first-rate philosopher. He's the one who, in my judgment, understands Descartes on the infinite, and therefore can move to the incarnate. I've always wondered if Schleiermacher knew him. I think he did, because of the importance of the God as infinite in Schleiermacher, and religion as a sense and taste of the infinite, and because they're both Platonists, which allow for that contemplative, intuitive understanding of the good beyond being, infinite love, etc. All right, so I want to end with a final comparison in that period. The other great figure, of course, in French religion and philosophy and theology is the incomparable, really, Pascal. It's easy to forget that Pascal was an extraordinary mathematician. Histories of mathematics, which I tend to read because of the infinite, the category of the infinite. I'll say he was one of the greatest who ever lived. He was also a great technologist who invented the first computer and the first bus system for the poor in Paris. He himself had a coach and horses, and so did all the rich people, but the poor had no way to get around except walking. He invented that too. He's an amazing man. And he had his famous personal mystical experience on the night of November in 1653, which you can read. It's very brief, starting with joy, 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 the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jesus Christ, not the God, notice, of the philosophers. He had no use for Descartes. He said Descartes is useless for religion. He's confused. He isn't. And in my opinion, that's because Pascal, as a great mathematician and great scientist, natural scientist, when he speaks of the infinite, as in his very famous statement, the eternal silence of infinite spaces terrifies me. One can understand that experience. To just look up and say, it's terrifying, if it's not in love with us, caring for us. And he thought, in French, you know, it's one of the times, you know, I've always been interested in relationship of form and content in thinkers, like Karl Barth, as I was mentioning to the professor before. In my opinion, he's one of the greatest theologians who has an immediate sense of what form you need for your content. If you're writing Romans, German expressionism. If you're writing his Anselm book, doctrine. If you're writing his dogmatics in the beginning, doctrine, and then more and more and more narrative. I mean, brilliant. Only an artist. He didn't think of himself so, but he was a great theologian, obviously, but he was also someone with a sense of, well, so was Pascal. Take any sentence in Pascal and you can see his genius is not only philosophical and scientific, it's also aesthetic. The sentence I quoted in English. In French, just listen to it in French for a moment and see what he's doing. Le silence éternel de ces espaces infinis. The sentence is long. You're in the infinite. M'effraie. terrifies me. All that's left of the I is an M apostrophe. It's not even a moi anymore. It's over. Right? The infinite spaces overwhelm. So, now the great difference between them is the difference between a theologian who thinks philosophy has an important role, namely Fénelon, a theologian who does, and a theologian, namely Pascal, or perhaps it's better to say he was a great religious thinker like Kierkegaard and Simone Weil. They're not exactly theologians, but my, are they great religious thinkers. Pascal, certainly had this night, this brief but overwhelming, apparently it lasted him for the rest of his life, experience of God, the so-called memorial. You know, no one knew he had it until he was dead. He had sewed it into his clothes so that it would always be near his heart, told no one. And when he was dead, of course, they're doing an autopsy and they discover, oh my God, this is what influenced him so. Just like Plotinus, Porphyry tells us, had the experience of the one 3 times. Well, and it was enough. I keep waiting. All right, then he also speaks of his other, I think, greatest insight in the Pensée, of course, is how he speaks of that that life consists among persons of 3 basic orders. There is the order of the flesh, which doesn't just mean sensuality, it does mean that. It also means the order of business, the order of everyday life. We all have to do all sorts of things. And we need to have common sense and be able to handle life. As Cicero says, everyone has to handle about 13 roles a day, now even more. So the order of the flesh is by no means to be despised. I mean, Pascal himself invented this bus route, which was in the order of the flesh to help people. Right? Then there's the order of intelligence. And his point, I think, is well made. That people in the order of the flesh who never enter the true order of intelligence, say of mathematics, of modern science, of theory, of philosophy, of theology, and its theoretical side, and its contemplative and argumentative side, well, they actually tend to think that intellectuals, as they call them, are rather out of it. They don't seem to know how to deal with ordinary life that well, often, right? Like the famous story of Thales and the milkmaid. Thales is looking at the stars and thinking and falls into the well, and the milkmaid laughs at him. Well, it's the first intellectual laughed at for centuries. Simone Weil said of the word intellectual, same word in French, it's an ugly word, but we deserve it. So there's the order of, now he certainly knew the order of intelligence, this great mathematician, this great scientist on the void and the vacuum and so forth. But he says, what people don't think about or understand is there's a third order in life besides the order of the flesh, the everyday, the order of intelligence that some people are involved in, but not everyone has to be. No one has to be an intellectual. Some people are called to it and live it. He said what he called the third order is the order of charity, love. Again, love is the key, right? And he said what people in the order of intelligence don't realize is that it is as hard for a person in the order of intelligence to understand the order of charity, where charity or love drives one, God's love, he means, as it is for a person in the order of the flesh to understand a person in the order of intelligence. People in the order of intelligence know why the people in the order of flesh don't understand them. What they don't know, for Pascal, is this other order, the order of love, the order of charity. They think they can argue themselves in or out of it, and it's not a point about argument. It's a point like his own experience or a point of these extraordinary intuitions. Well, that's why he thought, I think, that Descartes, for example, as this great philosopher, was of no use for thinking about the order of charity. None for Pascal. Fénelon said, oh yes, he is, because of the idea of the infinite could lead to infinite love as an idea. Well, to end, the theological difference between Fénelon and Pascal is not only clear in their age, it's clear in our age and all ages. It's one of the two great distinctions in the history of Christianity, that difference of some theologians who think philosophy is important and should be employed for your theological work, even for your mystical theology. And others who think, no, it leads to confusion, and it leads to the confusion of thinking you can argue yourself into believing in God or argue yourself out of it and not understand that it's a different kind of order of life called love or charity. It's a big difference. And therefore, even though Pascal was a brilliant philosopher, he didn't believe it was helpful for anything for understanding religion. As a result of this belief, Pascal, despite his acceptance of Descartes' mechanistic understanding of the physical world, which he did agree with, insisted that philosophy was in fact useless and confused for understanding God as love, which he agreed with Fénelon God is, or the order of love, the order where one can fully believe because of the experience in the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus Christ. Hence, Pascal insisted that Descartes' mechanical philosophy is indeed, he agreed, and he's a good scientist, so it means something, very useful for understanding the physical world, cosmology, physics, etc., but is confusing for understanding God as, what Fénelon is saying, as infinite love. For Fénelon, aided by a philosophy of the infinite. But not for Pascal, I repeat, the famous statement I read, a beautiful statement, that's about quantitative infinite. Pascal says it's the infinite of space, the terror that it can produce in one, or the infinite of time. And they're all infinite potentially, but as Aristotle insisted, not actually. You can never reach an actual infinite in time or space or number because you can always think of a higher number. You can always think of a further time. You can always think of a further space. So is there an actual absolute infinite which would be God? Aristotle, no, impossible. That's why many of the medieval theologians said no. Aristotle says no. Aquinas and Scotus bravely said, but yes. This is so, as Fénelon and Descartes did. All right. There are, among others, of course, to me, two great traditions, which are both philosophical, spiritual, and theological on naming God in the Christian tradition. There is the infinite God, who is also the incomprehensible God, the infinite loving God. And starting especially with Martin Luther, I've written on this, there is the hidden God, the God that comes not by thinking the idea of the infinite, but by facing sin and suffering, to which the only answer is the cross. The negativity of the cross shows the hiddenness of God in the cross, not in an idea, right? And the hidden God, I think, is also Pascal. It's also Simone Weil. It's also Kierkegaard. It's many distinguished thinkers, Christian thinkers. I think you should have both of them. Because, in fact, life itself includes radically different moments. different passions, different emotions, different moods, and Heidegger, in my judgment, was entirely right to say that mood should not be dismissed as having no cognitive value. It allows you to understand certain things that without this mood you could not. Stimmung for Heidegger. Luther himself, speaks not only of the hidden God of the cross, that extraordinary. I think he's the most original person on the hidden God. There were others, of course, but he's amazing, radical and amazing. He even speaks of the hidden God beyond the Word. In those moments which he admits that he is a Christian and other Christians, I admit, sometimes have. What sort of Pascal was talking about, sheer terror. That God can be overwhelmingly frightening, even terrifying at times. So that there's a hiddenness, a second form of hiddenness for Luther of God. It's his radicality. Just as those who understand the infinity of God and move to infinite intelligence and infinite love also move to incomprehensibility, the apophatic traditions. All right. What skepticism was to the 17th century, namely the major intellectual issue that any serious thinker had to face, and they all did. Nihilism is to the 21st century. Is there any meaning at all? Is it absurd? Is Pascal's sense of the terror of even infinite space, of looking up into the sky? What's the response to that? Well, for myself, the Christian God should be named. It's about names of God. The infinite, incomprehensible God and the radically hidden God. One need not allow either to take over exclusively. Even in relation to Christology, there's the different emphasis of the incarnation for those in the tradition of infinite and incomprehensible, and the cross for the hiddenness. Each can serve a genuine Christian option, even within an individual Christian life, different moments in one's life, I would say. And each is open to changes in different cultures, different situations, different temperaments. Western religious thought, including theology, in my judgment, would be greatly impoverished if we forgot one or the other of these extraordinary figures, Pascal or Fénelon, John Donne or George Herbert, Kierkegaard or Newman, Simone Weil or Jean-Marie Guillaume, Karl Barth or Karl Rahner, Bishop Butler or William Law, Sarah Coakley or Catherine Sonderegger. We need them all. I don't see you must go only one way. And philosophically, both ethics and aesthetics, and preferably together as in Whitehead. And above all in religion and spirituality, what the liberation theologians have taught us all to call the need for a prophetic, mystical form of spirituality in our day, where prophets eventually also become, as Gustavo Gutierrez, whom I know well, is also rather mystical, and where mystics, like Fénelon, in a pastoral situation, can become prophetic. It's Fénelon who provided the very daring criticism of Louis XIV, both in a letter and his famous work, Telemachus. Well, don't eliminate either, I suggest, from the ever-changing canon of Western religious thought and theology. Let the giants clash. Let them converse, and if they wish, argue. But let them be. Thank you. very kind, thank you.
You're not going away? Do you mind just that you finished so promptly that we have some time for questions, if you don't mind fielding some?
I'm happy, yes.
Although I just feel we need to take a couple of minutes here as our intellectual furniture kind of takes their places again. Deep breath, and then does anyone have a question?
Sir,
yes, please. I'll give you, just wait for the mic. Please.
When you began your discussion of Descartes, you mentioned that one of the things that he brings up in the Meditations is that once you think of the infinite, you cannot help but think God. And I was curious if you could...
I don't think I put it that way. If I did, I was wrong.
I'm sorry, could you correct me then?
If you're a Christian like Descartes, you think God. Okay. I have a long argument in this book that I've been working on forever about the infinite is also the entry to thinking of whether you should say God or the void, like a Buddhist positive void, or a negative void like Nietzsche, or maybe this is your point, or being, like Thomas Aquinas, or in a different way, Heidegger Thomas's essay, Heidegger's Sein, verbal, not noun, or the one, or the good, is the whole Platonic tradition, right? Or the gods, meaning the divine power behind the gods, Holderlin and others, Heidegger to an extent, or God. I try to, but there I have to argue, I can't just appeal to, and part of the argument is the idea of the infinite, but then another part of the argument for me is, and this is in Descartes, although he doesn't develop it much, is the ontological argument, which I continue to believe is the argument that deserves the most attention. But to me, it has to be linked with this kind of intuitive, contemplative moment of the. But the infinite could move into, I think it's the first name of God, but it's not the first name only of God. Is that perhaps your point, yeah?
It is.
One of them. Yeah.
I was also hoping that you might be able to answer whether you see that developing in Anselm, and,
oh, yes.
And why perhaps it did not catch on more in Anselm's time.
Yes. I agree with Catherine, who mentioned at lunch, that if you're looking for a marvelous instance in the history of Western philosophy and theology, Anselm is a great one. It's why I love, he didn't call it, of course, the ontological argument. It's very interesting to see those who thought he was right and those who didn't. Descartes did, in the fifth meditation. Hegel did. Charles Hartshorne did. Thomas Aquinas thought he was wrong. Kant thought he was wrong. So, it's another division of, right? And you work on Anselm then, yeah? It does seem to me also important in reading Anselm, as Karl Barth's reading and other readings, they're right, that it isn't only an argument, though more than Barth and others of that kind thing. It is also an argument, but it's also, he's a Benedictine monk. It starts with a prayer. Even Descartes, people never take seriously. The third meditation ends with a praise of God. It's a prayer. And the new French phenomenologists like Marion, my friend Marion and others, and even in a different way, Derrida, arguing that the logic of predication is not adequate to these issues. You also have to allow your discursive, argumentative reason and its predications, its propositions and its predications, to be willing to move beyond that into the contemplative, intuitive, even at times mystical sense of praise, as Derrida says, of praise rather than predicate, as a Christian would say, of praise become prayer. Derrida would hesitate on the prayer part, but he would say, yes. I think there's a lot to that. And it's another way of rereading Anselm. Right? Well, sorry, I'm going on.
Is there another question? Yes, please.
Leo, my friend. Yeah.
Thank you very much, David. This was wonderful. I really don't know Fénelon, so I started reading a little bit because you were lecturing on him. But what intrigued me in some of the spiritual writings were points of convergence with the Buddhist tradition.
Yes, indeed.
And especially this desire, and then the letting go of desire, the disinterestedness,
Absolutely.
even regarding one's
He didn't
own
know
eternal
Buddhism at
salvation.
first.
So I was just wondering if you've thought about these.
Oh, I do indeed.
Yes.
I could not agree more. That there are many moments of both Guillaume and Fénelon which can be read in a Buddhist way, just as they can be read in a Christian way. You know, you and I are both very interested in Christian-Buddhist discussion, and they've taught me many things, I think, after years in it. Among other things, they taught me how to read Meister Eckhart, who even more than Fénelon has that sense, right? And they taught me, they teach you about your own tradition too, I think you would agree. They taught me why, for them, Francis of Assisi is the most radical religious figure in the West. Because unlike Moses, unlike Jesus, and unlike Mohammed and everyone else, he believed redemption clearly was all living creatures, not only human beings. And especially now when we're finally catching on to how horribly we have treated our fellow animals, the Buddhists have, I think, much to teach, and much to teach Westerners to begin to take Francis of Assisi's spirituality more seriously. He's actually the most popular saint in the West, but that's dangerous because he's domesticated and trivialized. I said sometime, they've made him into sort of the eighth dwarf, somewhere between happy and bashful or something. And he's not that. He's a radical figure, right? And the Buddhists see that very clearly, I think. And also on desire. You know, my main issue, and maybe you can help me, we shouldn't take up everyone's time now, with Buddhism is on desire. I'm troubled. I keep asking my Buddhological friends and my Buddhist friends and you, what exactly is Buddhism holding to on desire? Is it saying that when desire becomes clinging and grasping, which Fénelon would say, Guillaume would say, eliminate it. But desire itself, what is the Buddha saying? Well, we don't know exactly what the Buddha was saying, but you know, different Buddhists seem to me to be saying different things. Partly for that reason that I became even more interested in Taoism. Because Taoism, you go with the flow, right? Therefore, desire. Buddhism, sometimes I think.
One day I was going into a temple in Kyoto with a Buddhist friend and asked him, what is Zen? And he simply said, living in the present.
Yes.
Because I think
that's Guillaume, that's Fénelon.
The problem is, as long as you're desiring to become a Buddha, the Buddha is a person without desires. You're caught up in this.
Right.
And my sense, at least the Buddhism that I've been with, the answer is to focus on the present moment.
Yes,
the answer
indeed.
is practice.
Yes,
because as long as you're posing the question in that term, you're going to spin your wheels and get into trouble. But by focusing on the practice, can you focus on this breath? And then you enter a different world.
And many of the Western mystics, I agree with you, are also like that. The point is this moment here now. That's the point. And that's what someone like, I think, Guillaume, who is so mistreated, and Fénelon, who was less badly treated, but badly treated too. It seems that many people can't accept that thought.
Yeah. That's part of what got Fénelon into trouble. You have to desire heaven, was the counter-argument. Yeah.
For Fénelon?
No, the argument. It's
right.
Bossuet and the people attacking Fénelon. Yeah.
Fénelon and Guillaume, you do not desire.
Yeah, you do not desire heaven. That's what's
you desire to love God for God's self. So in that sense, I agree with you. It's Buddhist-like. It's. I meant to read. May I just read to end this George Herbert poem? He's roughly the same time. One of the great poems in English literature, as he was one of the great figures, I think. Famous poem, Love, the poem that Simone Weil, she memorized two things that she kept in her head all the time. The Our Father in Greek, especially Thy Will Be Done. And George Herbert, she memorized it. She memorized the English, which it is in, obviously. Poetry has to be in its own language. So Love. It's roughly the same time as Fénelon, and roughly the same kind of, in the Anglican tradition, the great Herbert tradition of finally mystical love. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made your eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says Love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says Love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. It's a great poem about the love of God. Please, I should end, right? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, sitting about taking and eating, there's plenty of heavy appetizers out there for you. Please stay as long as you wish and have plenty to eat and drink. Thank you for coming.